The year was 44 before the Common Era, and Rome stood at the precipice of monumental change. Gaius Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the known world, had returned from his conquests in Gaul as a hero whose military genius had expanded Roman territory beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Yet beneath the marble columns of the Forum, and within the shadowed corridors of the Senate House, a different kind of storm was brewing. The very success that had made Caesar beloved by the common people had also made him a figure of profound fear among Rome's traditional elite. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon River 5 years earlier had not merely been a military maneuver. It had been a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. When he uttered those immortal words, "The die is cast," he had set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of Western civilization. His subsequent civil war against Pompey the Great had torn the Republic apart, pitting Roman against Roman in a conflict that left thousands dead and the very foundations of republican government shaken to their core. Now, in the early months of 44, Caesar held powers that no Roman had ever possessed. He was Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, a title that sent chills down the spines of senators who remembered when such absolute authority was granted only in the direst emergencies and for the briefest of periods. The traditional Roman system of checks and balances, carefully crafted over centuries to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power, lay in ruins at Caesar's feet. The signs of Caesar's growing autocracy were everywhere. He had appointed his own supporters to key positions throughout the government, bypassing the traditional electoral processes that had been the cornerstone of Roman political life. His image appeared on coins, a privilege previously reserved for the gods and long-dead heroes. Most disturbing of all to the Republican-minded senators, there were persistent rumors that Caesar intended to have himself crowned as king, a title so despised by Romans that it had been banished from their vocabulary for nearly 5 centuries. Marcus Junius Brutus walked through the streets of Rome with the weight of his ancestry pressing heavily upon his shoulders. He was descended from the very Lucius Junius Brutus, who had expelled the last king from Rome and helped establish the republic that Caesar now seemed determined to destroy. The irony was not lost on him that he, who bore the name of Rome's great liberator, now found himself in a position where he might need to act to preserve that same republic his ancestor had created. Brutus had once been close to Caesar, close enough that some whispered he might even be Caesar's illegitimate son, though such rumors were likely nothing more than malicious gossip. What was certain was that Caesar had shown Brutus considerable favor, advancing his career and treating him almost as a beloved nephew. This made the growing tension between them all the more painful. Brutus genuinely respected Caesar's abilities and had even supported him during the Civil War, but he could not stand by and watch as the republic he loved was transformed into a monarchy. The philosophical education that Brutus had received in Athens had instilled in him a deep reverence for republican ideals and the concept that no man should hold absolute power over his fellow citizens. He had studied the writings of the great Greek philosophers and historians, learning about the dangers of tyranny and the importance of civic virtue. These lessons now tormented him as he watched Caesar accumulate powers that would have made even the most ambitious of ancient tyrants envious. Gaius Cassius Longinus was a man of different temperament than Brutus, but his concerns about Caesar's growing power were equally intense. Where Brutus was motivated primarily by philosophical principles and family honor, Cassius was driven by a more practical understanding of political realities and perhaps a measure of personal ambition as well. He had served as a praetor and had hoped to advance further in the traditional cursus honorum, the ladder of political offices that ambitious Romans climbed throughout their careers. But with Caesar controlling all appointments and showing clear favoritism toward his own supporters, men like Cassius found their paths to advancement block. Cassius was also a student of history, and he understood that republics did not die overnight, but were gradually eroded by the accumulation of power in the hands of a single individual. He had watched as Caesar systematically dismantled the checks and balances that had protected Roman liberty for centuries, and he could see where this trajectory would inevitably lead. If Caesar were allowed to continue unchecked, the Senate would become nothing more than a rubber stamp for his decisions. and the Roman people would find themselves subjects rather than citizens. The relationship between Cassius and Brutus was complex and had evolved over many years of political collaboration and personal friendship. Cassius recognized that Brutus possessed something he himself lacked, the moral authority that came from his famous ancestry and his reputation for integrity. If a conspiracy were to succeed, it would need Brutus as its figurehead, for his participation would lend legitimacy to what might otherwise be seen as nothing more than a power grab by ambitious politicians. Throughout the winter months of 44, Cassius carefully approached Brutus with increasingly direct conversations about the threat that Caesar posed to the Republic. He reminded Brutus of his ancestors' heroic actions in expelling King Tarquin the Proud and establishing the Roman Republic. He pointed out that the same courage and devotion to liberty that had motivated the first Brutus was now needed again, and that history would judge the current generation of Romans by their willingness to act when the Republic was in mortal danger. These conversations were necessarily conducted in the utmost secrecy, for Caesar had developed an extensive network of informants throughout Rome, and any hint of seditious activity would have resulted in immediate arrest and execution. The conspirators had to be extremely careful about when and where they met, often using seemingly innocent social gatherings as cover for their treasonous discussions. They developed coded language and subtle signals that allowed them to communicate their intentions without explicitly stating their plans. As winter gave way to spring, the circle of conspirators gradually expanded. Cassius and Brutus began to identify other senators who shared their concerns about Caesar's growing power and might be willing to join their cause. This was an extremely delicate process, for approaching the wrong person could result in exposure and death for all involved. They had to be absolutely certain of each potential recruit's commitment to Republican ideals and their willingness to take the ultimate risk for the sake of Roman liberty. Among the first to join the conspiracy was Gaius Trebonius, a senator who had served under Caesar in Gaul, but had grown increasingly disturbed by his former commander's autocratic tendencies. Trebonius brought valuable military experience to the group and had maintained enough of a relationship with Caesar to avoid suspicion. His recruitment was crucial because it demonstrated that even Caesar's former supporters recognized the threat he now posed to the Republic. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, a distant relative of Marcus Brutus, also joined the conspiracy. Like Trebonius, he had served with distinction under Caesar and had been rewarded with important positions and honors. His decision to join the plot against his former benefactor was particularly significant because it showed that the conspiracy was not merely the work of Caesar's political enemies, but included men who had genuine reasons to be grateful to him, yet still believed that the Republic's survival required his removal. The conspirators faced a fundamental challenge in determining how to accomplish their goal. Simply assassinating Caesar would not be enough. They had to ensure that his death would lead to the restoration of Republican government rather than chaos or the rise of another strongman. They spent countless hours debating the best approach, considering various scenarios and trying to anticipate how different groups within Roman society would react to Caesar's death. Some argued for a more limited approach, perhaps forcing Caesar to abdicate his extraordinary powers and return to private life. But others, led by Cassius, insisted that Caesar would never voluntarily give up his position, and that half measures would only alert him to the danger, while failing to solve the fundamental problem. As long as Caesar lived, they argued, he would remain a threat to Republican institutions and a magnet for those who preferred autocracy to the messy compromises of democratic government. The question of timing was equally complex. The conspirators wanted to act before Caesar could further consolidate his power or, worse yet, have himself crowned as king. There were persistent rumors that such a ceremony was being planned, possibly to coincide with Caesar's upcoming military campaign against the Parthians. If Caesar were to leave Rome at the head of a large army while holding the title of king, it would be virtually impossible to challenge his authority upon his return. The conspirators also had to consider the practical aspects of their plan. Caesar was well protected by a bodyguard of loyal soldiers and rarely appeared in public without adequate security. They needed to find a time and place where they could approach him without interference, and where they could act decisively before his guards could intervene. The Senate House seemed like the most promising location, as it was one of the few places where Caesar might be found without his full military retinue. As the conspiracy took shape, the participants were forced to confront the moral implications of their intended actions. They were planning to commit murder, and not just any murder, but the killing of a man who had shown many of them personal kindness and who was genuinely beloved by large segments of the Roman population. The weight of this decision was particularly heavy for Brutus, who had to reconcile his personal feelings toward Caesar with his duty to the Republic. The conspirators tried to justify their actions by casting themselves as tyrannicides rather than mere assassins. They studied the examples of famous tyrannicides from Greek history, men like Harmodius and Aristogiton, who had killed the tyrant Hipparchus in Athens and were remembered as heroes and liberators. They convinced themselves that they were following in this noble tradition and that future generations would honor them for their courage in defending liberty against despotism. Religious considerations also played a role in their planning. The conspirators consulted various omens and portents, seeking divine approval for their intended actions. They interpreted unusual weather patterns, strange animal behavior, and other natural phenomena as signs that the gods supported their cause. This was not mere superstition, but reflected the genuine Roman belief that major political actions required divine sanction to succeed. The secrecy required by their conspiracy created enormous psychological pressure for all involved. They had to continue their normal daily activities, attending Senate meetings and social functions while concealing their true intentions from everyone around them, including their own family members. The strain of maintaining this deception while planning what amounted to a coup d'état was enormous, and several of the conspirators showed signs of the stress they were under. Marcus Brutus, in particular, struggled with insomnia and appeared increasingly haggard as the weight of his decision took its toll. His wife Portia, daughter of the famous Cato the Younger, noticed his distress and pressed him for an explanation. The relationship between Brutus and Portia was unusually close for a Roman marriage, based on mutual respect and shared philosophical values. Portia's father had been one of Caesar's most implacable opponents and had chosen suicide rather than live under Caesar's rule, so she might have been sympathetic to her husband's cause. However, Brutus felt that the fewer people who knew about the conspiracy, the safer it would be for everyone involved. The conspirators also had to consider what would happen immediately after Caesar's death. They could not simply kill him and hope that Republican government would spontaneously reassert itself. They needed a plan for managing the transition period and ensuring that Caesar's supporters did not simply install another autocrat in his place. This required careful coordination with other senators who were not part of the conspiracy, but might be willing to support the restoration of traditional Republican institutions. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator and defender of Republican values, was an obvious candidate for post-assassination leadership, but the conspirators debated whether to include him in their plans. Cicero was known for his inability to keep secrets and his tendency toward verbose self-promotion, qualities that made him unsuitable for the clandestine phase of their operation. However, his moral authority and rhetorical skills would be invaluable in justifying their actions to the Roman people and the Senate. As the Ides of March approached, the conspirators finalized their preparations. They had identified March the 15th as the optimal date for their action because the Senate was scheduled to meet that day, and Caesar was expected to attend. The meeting was to be held in the Theater of Pompey rather than the traditional Senate House because the latter was undergoing renovations. This change of venue actually worked in the conspirators' favor, as the Theater of Pompey was a more open space that would make it harder for Caesar's bodyguards to control access. The irony of holding the meeting in a building named after Pompey the Great, Caesar's former rival and victim in the Civil War, was not lost on the conspirators. It seemed fitting that Caesar should meet his end in a place that commemorated the man he had defeated and driven to his death in Egypt. Some of the conspirators saw this as another sign that the gods approved of their actions and that justice was finally being served. The final preparations involved ensuring that each conspirator knew his role in the assassination itself. They could not rely on a single assassin, both because the physical act of killing Caesar needed to be certain and because they wanted to share the responsibility among as many participants as possible. This would make it harder for Caesar's supporters to focus their revenge on any single individual, and would emphasize that the assassination was the act of a group of senators, rather than a personal vendetta. The night before the Ides of March, many of the conspirators found it impossible to sleep. They were acutely aware that the next day would either see the beginning of a new chapter in Roman history or their own deaths as failed traitors. The magnitude of what they were about to attempt weighed heavily on all of them, but they had passed the point of no return. Too many people were now involved. Too many preparations had been made, and the opportunity might not come again. As dawn broke on March the 15th, the conspirators made their final preparations and steeled themselves for the day that would determine the fate of the Roman Republic. They had convinced themselves that they were acting as patriots and liberators, following in the footsteps of their ancestors who had established and defended Roman liberty. Whether history would judge them as heroes or villains remained to be seen, but they were committed to their course of action and prepared to face whatever consequences might follow. The morning of the Ides of March dawned with an unsettling mixture of normalcy and tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Rome. Citizens went about their daily business, merchants opened their shops, and slaves hurried through the streets on various errands. Yet there was an undercurrent of unease that even those not privy to the conspiracy seemed to sense. The very air seemed charged with anticipation, as if the city itself was holding its breath in preparation for momentous events. Caesar had spent a restless night at his home, plagued by strange dreams and disturbed by reports of various omens that his household staff had observed. His wife Calpurnia had awakened screaming from a nightmare in which she saw her husband lying dead in her arms, covered in blood. The dream had been so vivid and disturbing that she begged Caesar not to leave the house that day, pleading with him to send word to the Senate that he was ill and could not attend the scheduled meeting. The omens that had been reported throughout the city were indeed troubling to those who believed in such things. Soothsayers had examined the entrails of sacrificial animals and found them to be malformed and inauspicious. Strange birds had been seen flying in unusual patterns, and there were reports of unnatural sounds heard in the night. A comet had been visible in the sky for several nights, which many Romans interpreted as a sign of impending disaster or the death of a great leader. Despite these warnings, Caesar was reluctant to cancel the Senate meeting. He was acutely aware of his image and reputation, and he knew that failing to appear would be seen as a sign of weakness or superstition. Throughout his career, he had cultivated an image of courage and decisiveness, qualities that had served him well in both military and political contexts. To suddenly change his plans because of dreams and omens would undermine the carefully constructed persona that was so crucial to his continued dominance of Roman politics. Moreover, Caesar had important business to conduct at the Senate meeting. His upcoming campaign against the Parthians required final approval and logistical arrangements, and there were various administrative matters that needed his attention. The conspiracy against him was so well concealed that he had no inkling of the danger he faced, and from his perspective, the Senate meeting was simply another routine political obligation. As Caesar prepared to leave his house, he was approached by a soothsayer named Spurena, who had previously warned him to beware the Ides of March. The man reminded Caesar of his earlier prophecy and urged him once again to exercise extreme caution on this particular day. Caesar's response, according to later accounts, was to dismiss the warning with characteristic confidence, telling Spurena that the Ides of March had come and nothing had happened. The soothsayer's ominous reply was that while the day had indeed come, it had not yet passed. The conspirators, meanwhile, were making their own final preparations. They had agreed to meet at the theater of Pompey well before Caesar's arrival, ostensibly to discuss the day's agenda, but actually to coordinate their actions and steel their nerves for what was to come. Each man carried a concealed dagger, and they had rehearsed their plan multiple times to ensure that everyone knew his role in the assassination. Brutus had spent the morning in contemplation and prayer, seeking final confirmation that his intended actions were justified and necessary. The internal struggle between his personal affection for Caesar and his duty to the Republic had tormented him for months, but he had ultimately concluded that the survival of Roman liberty required Caesar's death. He carried with him a small scroll containing excerpts from philosophical works that reinforced his belief in the righteousness of tyrannicide. Cassius, ever the pragmatist, focused on the practical details of their plan. He had positioned trusted allies at key points around the theater of Pompey to watch for any signs that their conspiracy had been discovered. He also had contingency plans in place in case something went wrong, including escape routes and safe houses where the conspirators could hide if their initial attempt failed and they needed to flee the city. As Caesar made his way through the streets of Rome toward the theater of Pompey, he was approached by several people who tried to warn him of danger. A teacher of rhetoric named Artemidorus had learned something of the conspiracy and prepared a letter detailing the plot against Caesar's life. He managed to approach Caesar's litter and press the letter into his hands, urging him to read it immediately as it concerned his personal safety. However, Caesar was surrounded by petitioners and well-wishers, all seeking his attention, and he handed the letter to one of his secretaries to be read later, a decision that would prove fatal. The procession that accompanied Caesar to the Senate meeting was impressive, reflecting his status as the most powerful man in Rome. He was carried in a litter borne by slaves, surrounded by lictors carrying the fasces that symbolized his authority. Various senators and other officials walked alongside, and the streets were lined with citizens who had come to catch a glimpse of their famous leader. To all outward appearances, it was a normal day in the life of Rome's dictator. When Caesar arrived at the theater of Pompey, he was greeted by the conspirators, who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the building. They maintained their normal demeanor, engaging in casual conversation and showing no signs of the tension they must have been feeling. The ability to conceal their true intentions while maintaining the appearance of loyalty required enormous self-control and acting ability. The Senate meeting began with routine business, various administrative matters and minor legislation that required attention. Caesar took his place in the chair reserved for him, elevated above the other senators in recognition of his supreme authority. The irony of the situation was palpable. Here was a man who had risen to unprecedented heights of power, surrounded by the very men who were about to kill him. Yet he suspected nothing of their intentions. As the meeting progressed, the conspirators gradually moved into their assigned positions. They had planned their approach carefully, ensuring that they would be able to surround Caesar when the moment came to act. Some positioned themselves behind his chair, others to his sides, and still others directly in front of him. To casual observers, they simply appeared to be senators taking their normal places in the chamber. The signal for action came when one of the conspirators, Lucius Cimber, approached Caesar with a petition requesting the recall of his exiled brother. This was a prearranged pretext that would allow the conspirators to crowd around Caesar under the guise of supporting the petition. As Cimber presented his request, other conspirators joined him, creating a crowd around Caesar's chair that would provide cover for their attack. Caesar initially listened to the petition with his usual attention to senatorial business, but as more and more conspirators pressed forward, he became uncomfortable with the situation. When he attempted to dismiss the petitioners and move on to other business, Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his shoulders, exposing his neck and chest. This was the predetermined signal for the attack to begin. The first blow was struck by Publius Servilius Casca, who stabbed Caesar in the neck with his dagger. The wound was not immediately fatal, but it marked the beginning of a frenzied assault that would see Caesar stabbed 23 times by the various conspirators. Each man wanted to participate in the killing, both to ensure that Caesar was actually dead and to share in the responsibility for the deed. Caesar initially tried to fight back, grabbing Casca's arm and crying out in surprise and pain. However, he was quickly overwhelmed by the number of attackers and the severity of his wounds. As the daggers continued to find their mark, Caesar realized the hopelessness of his situation and the identity of his attackers. The moment of recognition was captured in the famous phrase attributed to him, et tu, Brute, as he saw his beloved Brutus among his assassins. Whether Caesar actually spoke these words is a matter of historical debate, but they have become symbolic of the ultimate betrayal, the moment when a trusted friend reveals himself to be an enemy. For Brutus, striking the blow against Caesar must have been the most difficult moment of his life, the culmination of months of agonizing internal struggle between personal loyalty and political principle. As Caesar fell to the floor of the theater of Pompey, his blood pooling around the base of Pompey's statue, the conspirators stepped back to survey their work. The deed was done. The man who had dominated Roman politics for nearly a decade was dead, killed by the very senators he had appointed and favored. The irony of his death at the foot of his former enemy's statue was not lost on those present. It seemed as if Pompey had finally achieved his revenge from beyond the grave. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was chaotic and confused. The other senators, who were not part of the conspiracy, fled the building in terror, uncertain whether they too might be targets of violence. The conspirators themselves were covered in blood and breathing heavily from the exertion and adrenaline of their attack. They had succeeded in their primary objective, but now they faced the much more difficult task of justifying their actions to the Roman people and establishing a new government to replace Caesar's autocracy. Brutus attempted to address the remaining senators, explaining that they had acted to liberate Rome from tyranny and restore the Republic to its former glory. He held up his bloody dagger and proclaimed that they had killed Caesar not out of personal hatred but out of love for Rome and its ancient traditions of liberty. However, his words fell on largely empty ears, as most of the senators had already fled, and those who remained were too shocked and frightened to respond coherently. The conspirators had planned for this moment, but the reality of the situation was more overwhelming than they had anticipated. They had expected to be hailed as liberators, but instead they found themselves standing over a corpse in a nearly empty Senate chamber, uncertain of what to do next. The gap between their theoretical plans and the practical realities of revolution was becoming painfully apparent.